Can I start with you, Kat, just to hand over if you want to just give a little brief introduction to yourself and accessibility?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm the access producer at festival.org, and we create the annual Greenwich and Docklands International Festival. This year we were the first UK festival to receive the platinum status from the Live Events Charter Attitude is Everything. And my background is theatre and inclusion and accessibility. I was a former co-director of Blink Dance Theatre, which create accessible productions with a neurodivergent creative lead, and also do lots of work in community and education settings as well.
And Jane, would you like to go next?
Hello, I'm a freelance audio describer. I've been working in the field for about 12 years now, predominantly across live theatre, although some film as well. And immersive theatre is really where my passion is when it comes to audio description. There's more and more a drive in conventional theatre towards integrated description, and immersive is the place that has essentially come from. You know, you've birthed something new in terms of accessibility.
Colin?
I've been working around kind of multi-sensory experiences for probably 20 odd years now. On that journey, I've been part of Punch Drunk for since 2002. My role has always been a little bit blurred, but I'm a kind of a creative producer, but I'm always like 1 foot in creative, 1 foot in practical stuff. Back in 2004, for about 3 or 4 years, I was a senior project manager at Greenwich and Docklands Festivals, and that amazing organisation is what helped me open my eyes to around accessibility. And during that period of time, was fortunate to work for 4 years on Liberty, which is Mayor of London's kind of disability arts festival, and so learned a huge amount, which I was able to bring into a lot of the development of access that went on within the early Punch Drunk shows over the years. These days, I am just an associate creative producer of Punch Drunk, and I have my own creative studio with Stephen Dobby, who's the sound designer from Punch Drunk originally, and we're very much kind of focused on audio experiences. But I suppose for me, I'm always coming from a kind of an artistic point of view, and I'm interested in audiences being at the heart of things. And from my point of view, therefore, you have to be open to accessibility. Otherwise, I don't know how you're ever going to really truly engage with audiences.
What I'd like to do really is just kick off with asking the panelists if there's a sort of an example or an instance or a moment when you can think our approach to accessibility here was really, really good evidence for best practice and something that people might find useful as a takeaway. So, Kat, can I start with you?
So I'd like to talk about a production called The Architect, which was part of the Greenwich and Docklands International Festival. And it was a co-production between ourselves and the Actors Touring Company. And it was an immersive theatrical journey through time and space. And it took place on a London bus, on a red bus. It transported audiences on a journey through southeast London. It was asking how we create a blueprint for the future, and also marking 3 decades since the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Our approach to accessibility for this production, it's not actually the first time Greenwich and Docklands International Festival have done a show on a bus. So there was a precedent for how some of the things worked. You know, the things that we are starting with is thinking about, it was a theatre production, so there was speech and text throughout. So we needed to make sure that was accessible for deaf and hard of hearing audiences. So we did that in 2 ways. One was having a BSL interpreter that was integrated into the production. So the interpreter was present in the very earliest days of R&D. She wasn't someone that was kind of brought on at the very end. So therefore we could make sure that that experience was smooth and thought about how is this going to work on a moving bus from the get-go. And we also used a captioning software called the Difference Engine, which enabled us to, without any there was no power for us on the bus. So we could use a mobile technology to make sure that captions were sent directly to people's mobile phones. We also live audio described with a colleague here of Jane's. We live audio described the performance so that blind and visually impaired audiences could experience it. But there was also some challenges, and I think that's something, that is really important to say, is that there's always going to be compromises. Like one of the compromises for having an immersive show on a bus meant that there was only space for one wheelchair user per show. So that's a compromise in terms of accessibility, which you wouldn't have, in all of our work is usually free outdoors. So usually there's kind of a limitless capacity in terms of how many wheelchair users are able to attend. So that was something that was in some ways compromising our accessibility offer, although we did make absolutely sure that we had a bus which had that provision available. Other things that we did around the show and the information giving was there was an Easy Read guide available, which was a visual guide. If you're not familiar with Easy Read, it's a document where you would have images that go along with the sentences for text. And it can be a really great way for learning disabled or neurodivergent audiences who might want a bit more information before they attend a performance about what to expect, what might happen, and having it in that really accessible format. We also, alongside in collaboration with ATC, created an aftercare pack, because we acknowledged that although the production was in essence not in any way a historical reenactment, it was a very hopeful and celebratory production. The context around the show was going to be highly emotional and sensitive for many people. So there was an aftercare pack available which had signposts to organisations to kind of provide that support around mental health for that experience.
I was just thinking again from our discussion that you were saying that often companies really shy away if they don't have certain aspects of accessibility and just kind of push it to the side. How important is it to be like really explicit when something is also troubling in terms of its accessibility?
It was really important to us to make it really clear that there were limited wheelchair seats available. That information was available on our website, on the booking page. Also that not all performances were BSL interpreted, captioned and audio described. So we did a lot of work behind the scenes on making sure that the people who required those access provisions were definitely booked in for the right shows. We also had a kind of a front of house welcoming system where when people arrived, they were asked if they would like to board the bus first before anybody else so that they could make sure they were seated on the lower deck. They were given kind of early access to the bus. But I think being really, really clear about what is available when and what isn't available is really essential. And my role within GDIF is being that point of contact for any accessibility related questions. And there is a phone number and a dedicated email address. And I think that the feedback we often get is that being able to speak to somebody, being able to ask a question and have your query answered in a timely fashion by somebody who really understands is really beneficial for audiences and just feeling confident to attend the events. I guess another thing was there was no parking because the bus started in one place and ended somewhere else. So we had to be kind of really explicit for people whose access requirement might be that they need to drive to somewhere, that they would need to make their own plans for how to get back, or either use alternative transport or make their own plans. So I think we were never kind of shying away from the things about the production that would make it more challenging on an accessibility front. We were just being kind of very clear about everything in all of our comms around the event.
Thank you. Jane, would you like to jump in?
In terms of the gold standard for accessibility, the first place you need to be looking at is the disabled-led companies. Inevitably, people who have lived experience of disability are the first ones to think creatively about how they want to make a show accessible. We want to move away as much as possible from the idea of accessibility as this add-on once you've completed your show, and now we need to figure out how to fit the BSL interpretation and the captioning and the audio description, and you've got 2 seconds there in which you've got to cover 5 things happening on stage. And that will never be a perfect model. And that's the model we've fallen into in conventional theatre. And it's the model that we have such freedom to break away from with the various approaches of immersive theatre. In terms of work I've done, a project I've worked on myself that we did particularly well. In fact, it was associated with the Greenwich Festival, which is a tiny little puppet show called What's Happened to You?, which was an entirely disabled-led company. We integrated the BSL. There was someone moving around among the various characters, the various puppets, constantly interpreting. There was integrated captioning, And there was integrated audio description, which importantly was recorded and which the characters were able to interact with in the space, which meant that we did not have to have an audio described performance. We were able to give people who have that accessibility requirement access to whichever performance they like, because it's quite frustrating, obviously, if there's a show running for 6 months and you can only go to 2 dates of it. That's one of the great freedoms of integrating your access is that it's there from the start. You don't have to feel like it's this clinical thing which is going to take away from all the art you have put into the work. It can be a part of the art. It can add to the art. It can be something that is beneficial for people who don't even think of themselves as needing access requirements. I did some work long ago with Slunglow, a piece they did called Camelot, the Shining City, which wasn't billed as immersive, but very much was. And large parts of that took place outside. So they had everyone wearing headphones, because you don't want to have to bellow your lines from the other side of a major town square, because that's not particularly immersive for anyone to have all this yelling going on. And because you have the headphones and everyone has the headphones and everyone has that soundscape built in, it's then very easy to insert, for example, an audio description track into that soundscape that doesn't detract from it. And we found that people, even though we gave them an option to use either the version with or without audio description, we had people who were tuning into the audio described version just because, for example, they needed to sit down and they couldn't see very well from where they were seated. We had access for everyone. That's where we really want to be driving for, I think, in terms of immersive theatre, that the access can be part of the art. It can add to your art. It's not this thing that's going to just be a legal requirement. So that's what I would say. Look to the disabled-led companies if you want to see good access.
So would you say really it's about a shift in kind of attitude and a shift in thinking about it as an overall part of that creative process rather than that kind of add-on?
The earlier you can get anyone involved, be that someone with lived experience or someone like myself who's an access professional, like when you first have the germ of an idea, when you first have a venue, when you first have any kind of space, any kind of idea of the shape of it, if you bring us in then, we'll be able to, for a start, say, no, don't do it this way, do it this way, because you're going to create yourself a problem to be solved later if you do it that way. But also your world building, your world, the more you put into your world, the more full it is. And if you want disabled people to be in your world and accessing that world, then you fill it with accessible content. So,
lovely, thank you. Colin?
I'm trying to work out which thing to focus on. I think probably, seeing as it's so recent, so obviously I was quite heavily involved in setting up the Burnt City, the latest Punch Drunk project, which kind of came to a close about 2 weeks ago now. I think this whole point about making sure that it's being trying to be integrated into the process is really important. On that show, I'm in the company trying to champion a lot of the ideas anyway, but I've got limited knowledge and I definitely don't know everything. And so on that project, because it's such a big physical build of the set, we brought in an access consultant sort of within the... That project was elongated for a lot of different reasons, and also COVID. I mean, that project was about 10 years in development and it was supposed to open in 2020 and then COVID happened. So it meant our kind of creation process on it was a little bit strange. But at the point things were starting to get real and things were going to start getting built, we made sure that there was an access consultant who was looking at plans, was really just helping with... I mean, there is legal requirements you need to be hitting in terms of measurements and things, but then some of that is legal requirements. Some of it is not best practice. And if you don't talk to somebody who is living this experience, I think I'll try and think of one example. So you might have an elevator, which we inherited in that show, which was installed in a building in the 1980s. At that point, no one was thinking about anything other than manual wheelchairs. And so the size of that elevator is actually it is problematic for a lot of modern wheelchairs because of so many people now are using electric wheelchairs so that they have more control over their lives. So, I learned a hard lesson on that, in that we had an elevator that wasn't actually working. We were fighting to get an engineer down to look at it. We'd all kind of assumed that, it's an elevator, it's going to be fine. And then had a wake-up call about 2 weeks before the show opened. And Nikki, our access consultant, I was desperately always trying to get her into this lift. We could never get into it because it wasn't working. And then, finally, the lift, the engineer came in, everyone showed me this lift. And instantly, because I'd been talking to Nikki so much, I knew we had a problem because it wasn't actually big enough. So then we obviously have to then think about how we're communicating information out to audiences. So, and this point about that Kat's making about making sure that you try and get as much information out on your sites, because you want people to be able to make the choices for themselves and not have to keep asking every question. So on that project, we had 2 brand new elevators that had gone into one of the buildings, which were, perfect. And Nikki had been using those and we understood how they worked. But even on those, you want an access consultant, because some of these lifts that are created, you have to actually have the ability to press a button down for it to actually be able to ascend floors. That's not actually always the case for everybody. So then you've got to think about, well, how's someone going to use that lift? Are they going to need help with it? So sorry, I'm kind of going off all over the place, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you get someone embedded in your team, they can help you see some of these things and they can help you then be on the front foot about trying to solve them. Because at least I knew at the point we were opening that show that one of the elevators was not going to be suitable for every wheelchair user. And so we were making sure that information is communicated in advance, but then we also know how we're going to kind of deal with the situation. And I mean, one of the things that we sort of really tried to push over the years within the way Punch Drunk's trying to deal with audiences on the Mars shows, and I will say this is particularly about the idea of the Mars show, these free roaming worlds where people are moving around, is every audience member coming to that has a level of freedom about how they're trying to explore the world. And so if we're trying to make this show truly accessible, we need to build that into how an audience member is helped if they need assistance in the world. And so what we try to do is we try to encourage audiences to contact us in advance if they've got an access requirement, so it can be kind of discussed. And if necessary, if it's deemed necessary and somebody wants it, there is an access steward that can be available. That access steward, we do have a limit. There is only normally 2, possibly 3 that's available. And so again, it's the kind of thing you want to communicate in advance, and and obviously I'm talking about this as a big show that's got a big team that we've got the ability to support this. But it could be, if you're doing a smaller scale project, the idea of having access stewards available for every show could feel very daunting. But maybe if that was the case, then maybe you think about making sure one of your shows is accessible and you make sure that you've got more staff working on that day. The first thing we're trying to do is have a conversation with the person when they arrive to try to ascertain what experience they want to have. And obviously a lot of audiences that are turning up to a Punch Drunk show, they don't know what the experience is going to be. And so if it's a first time visitor, we can be kind of trying to explain that it's about choice for them, but giving them the option to have it be slightly guided if that's what they want. And obviously if someone's got a physical disability, that could be quite important because they're not going to necessarily know how to navigate around the space. But it's this point, it's sort of establishing this point of contact and conversation at the beginning, and not trying to assume what this person wants. And I will say that the front of house team and the stewarding team on the last Punch Drunk show, as with all of the work, it's kind of devised, and a lot of this has to be devised, and it was built over the 18-month run. But by the end of it, there was a really strong team of people that were going way and above, trying to make sure that they were facilitating the best journey possible for someone. And with a show like Burnt City, we've got a lot of repeat audience, and that's true within people that's got access requirements. And so actually what somebody maybe wants starts to change over the course of the run. So as with, you've got some fans of the show that are coming and they've made a decision in advance what show they want to then create within the world. And then we were trying to work with someone, if they had an access need, to try to help them have that experience within the show. And that's a very particular kind of, in some ways, quite a unique situation. But if you are making work that's potentially going to create a lot of repeat visits, maybe think about the fact that the access requirement is going to change over the course of the run.
It can be quite daunting, and this is kind of the last question that I'll pose to the panel up here, and then we'll open to the floor. It is really daunting, and if that hasn't been embedded kind of in a process before and approaching it for the first time, what would be your advice really for makers as to things they can do, like low-hanging fruit? What can they do quite easily and quite quickly and quite affordably to start to shift and change their practices to be more accessible, or at least to be more accessibly aware as well?
All freelancers and all core team working for GDIF and all volunteers on the festival have some form of accessibility and inclusion like training, which will include things like how to communicate with somebody with a communication access need, understanding the social model of disability, because I think when people can understand that, then the whole framing of around accessible practices changes. So I think kind of like that having that understanding of why is really, really important. And there's lots of ways to do that are very affordable or free in terms of like developing that knowledge and that understanding.
Echoing what's been said earlier, make sure it's someone's job. If you're a one-person company, it's your job. But make sure that if someone has a question, then they don't have to spend a week chasing you by email, because they just won't come to your show. If you make it hard for them to come to your show, they will decide to go to a different show. So make sure it's someone's job is the first thing. Never assume that you don't have that you're too small, that you don't have the budget or ability to do something. I'm actually going to reference something with an enormous budget now, because I'm going to go back to the Burnt City, but for a specific anecdote, which is a blind friend of mine who attended it and had an interaction with a performer where they were showing some papers. And obviously she would not have been able to access those papers. The performer then pulled out the same papers, but in large print. And this excited her so much she had to go and cry in the toilets afterwards. It was just such an absolute thrill for her that someone had thought about her enough that they had provided paperwork in large print. If you have paperwork in your show, even your bar menus, if you have a bar, and make sure you have a large print menu. It can be the tiniest things. It can involve a photocopier sometimes. Obviously, some things are going to be more costly, are going to be harder for you to access, particularly things like BSL interpretation. That is very much a specialist job, but there are things that everyone can do. Anyone who can put together a show can definitely do these things.
What I was fortunate to get exposed to, as I was explaining at the beginning, I was fortunate to have worked on Liberty, which was a disability arts festival that the Mayor's office runs and is still running now. But I was involved in that for about 4 years, and every single person working on that project, from stewarding to production crew, everyone would go through access awareness training, and it would be a session, and it would just really help you start to understand things from a point of view of someone who's got an access need. And as soon as you can start to fall into that headspace, then and the big bit of training, and this was done by Attitude is Everything, did the training. And this is an organization that a lot of it's come about a desire to try and make a lot of live music events accessible, and that's where that company came from. But the name of that organization says everything to me, because it is just this attitude. And so it's about trying to stop this sense that someone with an access need is other, and it's just like, we're all the same. And it's just like, once you can start to get to this point where you can talk to people, then it all becomes easier. And it can be just little things that you could do for somebody that will just show that you're actually you're thinking and you're trying, and you're not going to be able to do everything. There is lots that was not achieved in a project like Burn City. We didn't get to a point where there was a show with any BSL interpretation. That's something which, on another big project like that, I'm going to really be thinking about where the content may be going. We got a little bit blindsided because we're a devising company, and a lot of our big mass shows have actually been quite wordless. And so the idea of BSL was never necessarily something that was at the forefront of anybody's mind. But in the 8-week creation process, and then the many months that a project then kind of tweaks over time, there was actually a lot more, there was just a lot more vocal content than I've ever seen before. It was something that I did used to think about a lot. I was like, it's a shame we didn't embed this in the beginning. And then it does become a little bit of a challenge of how you suddenly then bring that in meaningfully.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to open up to the floor now if people have questions. So if you'd like to just raise your hand, and we have some mics that will come around.
Hi, my name is Alex. I work for Catapult. I think you were kind of going off talking about it anyway, Colin. You were talking about if you could do something different next time. And that's the sort of question I think I have is if you encountered an issue in any all three of you guys, if you encountered issues that you've had in the pieces that you've put together that you weren't able to address this time, what would you do differently next time, and why couldn't you address them this time?
Yeah, I think something for me that really became very apparent during this year's festival was the potential but also the limits of digital resources. So for many of our shows, we had digital audio description introductions. So that would be like a 5-minute audio track that would exist on SoundCloud that would explain the visual world of the piece. But then also there were other tracks which would have been audio description digital, but throughout the whole performance, which is something that can work particularly off something like dance, where it's very tightly choreographed, so you can be sure that what is happening will be in time with a digital audio description. But when I was on site, and particularly with blind and visually impaired audience members, I noticed that it's great to have this, but also having it kind of via QR code is quite challenging because that's not actually a very accessible model. So it's fine if there was kind of volunteers and members of staff who could identify that access requirement. Also bear in mind, this is for free, unticketed, just show up events. If you can identify those people and then support them to access the QR code, great. But if not, then that can kind of fall through the gap. Similarly with kind of having easy read documents available by a QR code, you're also relying on somebody having a device, having data. All of those things actually can be potentially kind of exclusionary. So I guess that's something that I'm really going to kind of be thinking about for next year is like, are there other ways that we could do that would just make it's because I guess it's great to have the access provision, but you also need to make sure that the way it's being accessed is as kind of streamlined for audiences as possible. Otherwise, I guess there's a danger that it can be kind of a thing that exists, and you can say, oh, how fantastic, we have all these things that exist, but if the usability of them isn't quite there, So I guess that's something that always kind of thinking about, okay, how can we make it better?
It's quite a hard one because of the sheer diversity of immersive work. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model. So in terms of what would I do differently, probably everything. It's been a constant when I've been working on immersive work, a constant evolution of trying to make it work, essentially. The first sort of completely open world immersive show that I audio described on was The Great Gatsby. And I'm going to be completely honest, I don't think I did it terribly well because I was coming from a conventional background and trying to adapt a conventional description to the logistics of an open world space. And so okay, that didn't work so well, scrap that. Then I went on to do the Doctor Who one and went in with a much more kind of character-led approach. But ultimately, there's also, I'd have done, the main thing I would have done differently was keep open world spaces open world, because companies mostly have shied away from this. They tend to get a bit scared and go, no, we must make sure that the disabled people have the experience we want them to have. So we'll do one show and one path, and this is what they can see and hear and experience. And that, I think, is the mindset that needs breaking free of. They might not have the perfect experience if you don't plan it out for them, but that the same goes for every audience member. In a lot of immersive work, choice is key, opportunity is key. So yes, I don't know exactly what I would do differently because the next show will be different, but I know that it's a constant process of evolving it and trying to open the world up to everyone.
Well, that fixing down becomes an othering in itself, doesn't it? And it takes away some of the agency that is at the heart of that approach to making that kind of experience.
At that point, you're essentially just making a conventional theatre in a big room.
It's promenade, isn't it? It becomes promenade, then you're just pushing them through a track.
You're losing your immersion, and the absolute first thing that I want to do when I come in on an immersive show is preserve the immersion. If anything, try and make it more immersive. So yes, it's a constant evolution of process at the moment. So
I think I'm going to be a stuck record. I think what I would do differently if I was influencing, especially if it was a large project, I would just try and make sure as many people got trained right at the beginning. And maybe, really, and even if you couldn't get the entire team, making sure people from every department at least are within there championing it. Because, I definitely feel at times, at some points in projects I've worked on, I felt like I'm the only one that's really understood where I'm trying to help everybody get to. And sometimes you'll hit barriers from people. And it's hard. I think one thing you've got to try and think about what your project is and if someone's coming from a very pure artistic place, sometimes there can be some challenges around compromise that some people may be unwilling to go on. But I think even helping people and helping everybody understand that collectively we've made that choice, it could be important to then help you all deal with things that may come up further down the line. But it is, as I said, I was stuck record. I was just like, train people if you can. And then if you can't, get some training for yourself so that at least you can then be championing it in the work that you're doing.
And that's something I think as an organisation, IEN are quite keen to start signposting some of these things. So when we send out our feedback survey forms, which we will, because we always do, it's important to know your thoughts. This is an area we'd really like to understand kind of what access to information you need, if there's ways in which we can find ways to make accessing that training easier as well. So when you do get the survey forms, please bear this in mind and just let us know what would be useful for us to start help providing or giving access to as well as we move forward, just because we would like to be as helpful as possible in giving you access to those things. Any other lots of questions?
Hi. So we've talked a bit about the idea of getting training for like yourself independently. So I'm curious if there are sort of twofold, if there are any things you would recommend in terms of training and learning for yourself, and also any particular good sources of information to like share with an organization. Like I know I was talking to, someone who was putting on an event and tried to explain to them accessibility, but wanting to be able to hand them a resource that would sum up some things in a really nice, digestible way, rather than me just trying to spat off what I understand. So any recs for resources or training?
I think I've shared a list actually, which will come out, which has got some training and also some specific documents. So some things would be Without Walls have got an accessibility guide it's specifically about outdoor theatre, but I think there's a lot of crossover with immersive. So if you Google like Without Walls access, also Attitude is Everything, do you have some kind of free resources on their website. And then there's a whole host of others. Obviously some of it is quite specific to different kinds of access needs, kind of understanding. But I think that
outdoor arts are quite evolved in this space actually, aren't they? So there's a lot of a lot of resources associated to outdoor arts because they're kind of quite ahead of us in that respect. So accessing those and pulling some of those across, and we will share those resources after the event today as well, so that everybody can access those, which I think will be great.
Yeah, I guess one example that is free is there's communication access training, which is run by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. So, and if you just Google communication access, that should come up. It's free, it's online, it's very doable in like maybe a half day. And I think what is really brilliant about that is it breaks down communication over face-to-face, communication over the phone, communication over email, written communication, and also communication access needs is something which is kind of a very broad umbrella. People may have a communication access need for so many different reasons. So yeah, that's certainly something that I'm kind of like really flying the flag for, particularly for anybody who's in that customer-facing or audience-facing role.
Hi, I had a question about a lot of immersive theatre is often improvisational led, particularly the work that I make. And what advice would you give to stuff where a pre-recorded audio description would be impossible to make because the idea of what's happening next is completely unknown?
Recorded audio description isn't the norm. It's come up in a couple of examples I've given there, but actually it's predominantly live theatre is live audio described. So there's a few ways you could deal with that, but I would say probably what you want to do is get a describer or someone, this is again something where you could quite possibly practice just using someone with lived experience of visual impairment. So either someone like myself or someone with an experience of visual impairment, and try the piece out on them effectively, because you could live audio describe it. I've described pieces that are completely ad-libbed. Inevitably, you get some line crashing and things. But also, if you're thinking of something that's quite an intimate space, it's much more beneficial to you if you just have in your head where you might need to naturally explain what's going on to someone, as opposed to having that extra voice in the background. This is the thing with all immersive work. The first thing to consider is the environment. Is there a logical reason to have an extra voice in the background, or is it just you and the audience member? If it's an intimate space like that, you don't really want to add anything else in between you. So I think that's something that you'd probably be best approaching with a bit of training and right from the start, integrating it into the work.
If it is like a period show, so like you don't necessarily want to use any sort of like digital things because you want to keep it immersive. So what would be some of your advices in this kind of approach?
I think having BSO interpretation would, could be really brilliant, because that is another human where there isn't kind of any kind of like digital, period associations. I suppose also, is there a way in which any resources could be kind of still part of the world? So, for example, let's say if you wanted to create an easy read visual guide to the event, would there be kind of creative ways of keeping that kind of like linked into the world of the show? But yeah, I think that's an interesting one.
I mean, obviously it's a challenge. Again, I'll tend to go first with audio description just because that's my specialism. So if you wanted to, then it's been done before. You can create a character who is your audio describer. You can put them in role, I don't know, but depending on the period setting, maybe it's a servant or something, someone who would generally be in the background, isn't at the center of the space, but can be around and can speak to anyone who needs that service without introducing any technology whatsoever. It becomes harder when it comes to things like captioning, but I have on some things seen people literally passing notes. If it's something where it's all, people are being a bit, can't think what the word is, secretive, you might write a little note and pass it to someone as opposed to speaking it out loud. Again, it's all very environment-led. It depends entirely on the piece. Please don't be scared to come and ask me about any of these things during the day, because honestly, I'm quite happy to give advice, and the weirder the problem you bring me, the better.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more.
Hiya. Sorry if this is not the best phrased question. I guess in designing a space, specifically designing a safe space for like autistic friendly audiences or audiences that are prone to overstimulation, how would you sort of go about designing a space like that? What level of immersion do you think should sort of still be retained?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I guess it links to this idea of still keeping it kind of within the world. But I suppose, what you would be looking to do would be to kind of reduce the sensory input within that space. That doesn't mean that there is no sensory input. But I guess it would be kind of like low lighting. If there was music, it would be kind of at a low volume, kind of and quite kind of calm. You can have kind of things in the space, possibly, particularly maybe kind of tactile things or things that can be used for that kind of regulation. And maybe if there's a way in which they kind of link in with the world is possible. But I guess also maybe it's something around the stewarding of that and how that space is kind of made welcoming, how it's made clear who that space is for. Diverse UK are a autistic-led charity, and they're doing some fantastic work. So they have quiet spaces, kind of calm spaces at lots of UK festivals, and where they kind of create the space. That's kind of their expertise, and then they also manage the stewarding of those spaces, and those spaces are stewarded by autistic and neurodivergent staff that kind of really get it. So I think there'd be a really good place to, and I think it's, opening up a conversation with an organisation like that would be kind of a really, really great place to start in terms of like thinking about how to get that balance. Yeah.
Can I just I was going to say as well, secrecy is such a big part of kind of immersive and kind of not exposing some of those things. And that's for lots of different reasons. But I think as well, just like you were saying, giving more information before audiences come as well can be a way of exposing and opening up some of those discussions if the space is quite full on and has a loud soundtrack or has strobing lighting or any of those sorts of things. Again, it's just that information, making that available is a good start to that, I think.
If it's a fairly large space that you're working in, it's very handy to have, essentially, I've worked on shows where people have had a safe word because they might need to get out of that space fast, and it might not even be to a safe space. It's just, I need to get out of this space fast, and I can't necessarily communicate that easily to a steward. You can even give someone a card, something like a lanyard that they can basically go, I need to get out now. So it depends very much on whether you're talking about creating a nice, soft, safe environment they can retreat to for 5 minutes, or whether you're talking about relaxing the whole performance space, or whether you're just talking about in the event of an emergency. There's sort of different approaches that you can take there. Relaxing in immersive spaces are probably the hardest job you're going to have, because it is by its nature so multisensory. So yes, that you're thinking about it at all is wonderful.
Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is pull us to a close to give everyone a little bit of time to be able to navigate the lift and the facilities and all of those sorts of things ahead of the next panel. So if we could have a lovely round of applause for our speakers, that would be incredible. And I think everyone is at least around for the rest of the morning, so you can catch them in those break moments that we have between the panels. So the next panel in here is going to be on sustainability in about sort of 15 minutes or so. So please do stretch your legs and make your way to refreshments and the facilities. And I might see some of you again very shortly. But thank you very much. It's been incredible and useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.